This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal, medical, or mental health advice. We speak from our personal experiences and opinions. The views expressed are solely those of the individual speaker and are not intended to malign any group, club, organization, or business.
Welcome to Confronting the Line, where we take on the world of personal development, transformation, and self-help and examine the sometimes blurred line between transformation and exploitation. My name is Mark Tafoya, and I'm here with Ann L. Peterson, author of the book, Is This a Cult?, which examines some of the questionable practices of Landmark Worldwide. It's great to see you, Ann.
Thanks, Mark. Good to be back.
Yeah, we took a week of, doing personal stuff. I was home at my high school reunion. Ann is, of course, busy making her future castle in the Northwest. And
Right.
we took a little time off, and then we're now kind of coming into fall weather, and it's a little less hot. Our guest today is Gerette Buglion. She is an educator, author, and a spokesperson for survivors of high control groups. She's the founder of Living Cult Free and Writing to Reckon. For 18 years, Gerette was herself a member of a high control group. After leaving, like many of us, she struggled with the questions, how did this happen? Why me? How do I prevent others from making the same mistakes? So in 2021, Gerette published An Everyday Cult and has dedicated her life to supporting survivors' journeys as they deconstruct their experiences. Then in 2023, Gerette published Writing to Reckon Journal for survivors of spiritual, religious, and cultic abuse, which offers survivors an educational and supportive space to process their experiences, as well as a guidebook for writing their stories. Welcome, Gerette.
Oh my goodness. It was beautiful introduction there. Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you so much, Anne.
We're
It's
just so
an honor.
excited to have you here with us today because, you have such a depth of experience in this realm, certainly more than we do, right? We just kind of fell into this.
We're newbies. We're so glad you're here. I met, for our audience, I met Gerette when she reached out to me over a program that I partnered with Seek Safely on recently called Safe Practitioners Workshop. And Gerette
Fabulous
joined.
work.
Yeah, thank you. So, but we were just like, we got to get started. Part of the Seek mission is to educate. And, I've come to really realize myself, like, we're not going to get rid of all the cult leaders, all the narcissistic, leaders, whatever term we want to use, in the world. We're just not gonna. And not that we shouldn't try in whatever ways there are available to us, but what we can do is educate ourselves. And that's really the part of the journey that I think both Mark and I are in, is just really having come to recently reconcile with the dark side. I call it the dark side of Landmark Worldwide. So there's lots of light side. There's a lot, that is well publicized, well known, been talked about, so on. And like with all these groups, there's always, people become a part of them, fall apart of them because there's good stuff there. Or it matches something we think or feel that it matches something that we are really passionate about or up to and whatnot. So, but this show, we're really looking to stand on that line so we can look both ways. And we are particularly focused right now on the dark side because that has been what has been hidden, swept under the rug, whatnot. And our understanding, one thing I want to say for our audience too, our understanding of things like trauma, somatic learning and healing, neuroscience. I mean, so much has happened in just the last 10 years. And so many of these groups and programs are based on methodologies, methods of delivery and whatnot in the 70s and the 80s that we're now coming to learn and understand are not so healthy. So for me, we're here also inside of a commitment to evolve the personal development industry, so it's not just education to protect ourselves, but education to kind of grow up. That's how I feel. I feel like I'm growing up. I'm about to turn 56 and I think I might almost be at adulthood. But anyway, to just kind of grow up into the next thing as we, understand more. So I'm so excited, Gerette. You and I have been kind of playing together in that workshop, but then we really got some one-on-one time on Tuesday, and I got to really learn a lot more about who you are, what you've been up to, and I've already put your book on my book reading list, and just look forward to lots of collaboration, and so excited to have you here. So anything you want to share with us before we jump into our the topic we're going to talk about today, everyone, is terms. There's all these terms, love bombing, grooming, indoctrination, all these terms being tossed around. And so when I was speaking with Gerette on Tuesday, I said, you are a cult educator, and I would love to have you on. Mark and I were going to start talking about these terms and have you on to join us in that conversation. But before we go there, I'd like our audience to get a chance to get to know you a little bit more, because I think we're going to be seeing lots of you. So anything, what would you like to share with us, just either about your story or your commitment, just whatever. I want to give you a chance to voice.
Awesome. Well, as I said, honored to be here. And my experience was 18 years in a cultic group that was like a self-help New Agey organization centered on working with dreams. And to me, what might be most relevant about my personal experience is that it also was secular, as Landmark is. And I do want to be transparent about the fact that I have never done Landmark. I am not going to know the terms. Like, you are the experts on Landmark. You also have learned a whole lot in, your experiences. I mean, I am deeply impressed with the work that you've been doing in such a short time.
Thank
So
you.
please don't belittle yourself in that way, in that regard, Anne. And I'm sure the same is true with you, Mark, as well. But what's interesting, the one thing that might be, in addition to the fact that it's a secular, I was also in a secular organization, is that we used some large group awareness training type techniques in the group that I was in. So there might be some places of intersection, and we can kind of talk about that as we explore. But again, you're the Landmark experts, but I have had the experience of doing retreats was a huge part of the group that I was in.
We should say just a little to ride your, on your coattails there a little bit, which I just got very present to, as a phrase I learned from Werner. So I'll be finding a new one. But there's
a lot of those.
I don't know if you experience this, but a big part of my sort of waking up, if you will, I started watching, all these docuseries are coming out. Now, I was not able to watch the Scientology stuff until really recently, because I had a whole special pride that I never got involved in Scientology. And as I've gotten to know Chris Shelton and watch some of this, I'm like, oh, I guess I was in Scientology Light, which is the joke about Landmark. And but one of the things that I've noticed about these groups, they're similar. They're the same. Like, their word salad might be a little bit different, like the way they use certain terms and words, and, their tech, or we called it in Landmark, the work, that's all part of the formula. And we can get into that in longer conversation, but might be somewhat kind of distinct, but not very much. And the large group awareness training is something, while it's sort of, has been being looked at a few times, but not very much. Thank God for Dr. John Hunter, who's now doing some really great academic research on the phenomenon of large group awareness training. And that might be a term for us to just kind of quickly look at, because I know most people think like, oh, it's a group environment, but that's only an aspect. That's not. I do other group trainings. The spiritual group I participate with is absolutely fabulous. I've never had any experience of manipulation, abuse, coercion, like nothing. And we meet as a group. So just being a group is not the qualifier for large group awareness training. And yet, from the popularity of EST, all this stuff was born. Scientology kind of took that religious route, but Landmark EST started with EST, then the Forum under Werner Erhard and Associates, and then that became Landmark. That's that lineage. And it's the same people, including Werner, is at the heart of it all the way through. So the name has changed, but the work, it's been gussied up and somewhat modernized, but fundamentally it's the same work. It's the same foundation.
They businessified it, right? They made it more like businessy stuff,
Well, they tried to make it homogeneous. they've tried to make it really homogeneous. I mean, they have nailed the 90s. That's my joke about them, totally in my opinion. Don't sue me over that. But it's like they have nailed the 90s. They got it down. The sort of cis, homogeneous look and feel and whatnot, and to their trainings and their leaders and so on. So anyway, I digress, but I just wanted to pull on that little large group awareness thing, because I think, and I love that you haven't done any landmark and that we can compare notes, because I think then what's more important than exposing any one organization, what's way more important than that is exposing the tactics, exposing the outdated, outmoded, unhealthy tactics that are used. And what we're now seeing is they're not just used inside of spiritual groups or yoga. Yoga's the cross section between the wellness and spiritual, or health groups like that or whatnot. But I think you and I are both examples of, we're professionals, normal people who went looking to have, more tools to be more effective in our relationships and our professional lives and so on. And this is, on the face, it's a seminar company. And
you're so right, Anne, that there actually is what my wonderful colleague Esther Friedman and I have presented on is the cult template. So that they're like, on some level, they're all the same. And, by looking at, as you said, the tactics, I tend to think of it as, let's look at the patterns. What are the patterns that we see in a cultic religious group? What we see in a cultic, industrial or corporate or business group? And how is that similar to something that is, like you said, yoga or, or even these really small, as what Esther calls, mom and pop groups, just these kind of really, really small, you think that they can't possibly be a cult. And like the group that I was in, the reason I call it an everyday cult is that, we were not living on any compound together. We were all working, had our jobs, had our businesses out in the world. And then we would come together. What joined us was this ideology. And the fact that the ideology and the narrative that the organization layered onto us was one that actually, we didn't know it at the time, was controlling us and filtering into all aspects of life, rather than, oh, I'm just learning about this great new thing and it's supporting my life and it's making my life richer. I thought all those things, but what I couldn't see at the time was that I was actually systematically losing my sense of autonomy, losing my capacity for discernment and for critical thinking. And
Mark
to me,
and I,
we're getting ahead of ourselves.
Oh,
well,
man.
no, it's so good, Gerette. Like this is why I was so excited. I mean, Gerette and I could have talked like all day Tuesday. It was unfortunately we only had an hour, but we're both kind of shaking our heads because, I would say, we're a little bit at the stage of just really unconcealing that, and not just the first thing you get is the concept. And then in landmark parlance, you begin to discover it for yourself, which just means you begin to really experience the idea and know it in a more, intense, like personalized way. And one of the things you just said, I'm curious, did you find, this is something I'm really just starting to unconceal for myself, that the language, any profession, anything, this is the defense you hear, has a specialized language. And in landmark, they introduce the specialized language. We're going to introduce a specialized language, and it's so that you can discover these concepts for yourself. And at the end of a lot of the programs, they'll even tell you, now don't go use that language on other people because you'll be weird, And that even gets said sometimes in the programs. But what happens is what I'm finding and just seeing is that the damage or the negative impacts of these trainings come when you get stuck participating there. And then God forbid you get into an accountability, like a leadership role or a staff role. And that's a whole other shit
It's
show,
another
frankly.
day.
It's like a whole, that's where it gets super more obviously cultish. But when we're just participating and we do learn these languages, did you find or experience in your group that the language itself does begin to separate you? Because that's one of the big defenses. It's not a cult because it doesn't separate you from your family, except for pretty soon. Like, I know people have lost their jobs because they won't stop using the language or they won't stop sharing, or they
inviting
just
people
like,
to every event. Yeah.
but I've been
Yeah,
seeing the
well,
language itself separates, right?
the language itself is absolutely an integral part of the control mechanism. And, I think it's woven into each controlling group in one way or another. But I haven't met a cult yet that doesn't have its
Can you
own
say more
language.
about
They're
how the language
specialized. Yeah.
controls? Like how that, because
Well,
it's
I think
interesting
it's,
you're linking that with control. I'm not quite sure if I've heard it exactly that way, but that's really standing out for me. Can you tell us more about that?
well, so for example, in the group that I was a part of, the favorite word was pathology. So when you think of pathology, tell me, what do you think of? What does that word mean to you?
Well, sickness, pathology, usually in the medical sense, is like there's a group of cells that are sick, and we've got to isolate
Mm-hmm.
that and cut it out, right?
I,
Right,
I,
right.
I think of kind of habituated personality almost like my personality profile is synonymous with a pathology. I'm a this kind of person or I'm a that kind of person is my pathology. I don't know if that's the right use, but that's how I think of it.
Yeah. So in the group that I was in, that I call CTL, the Center for Transformational Learning, pathology had not only its own definition, it had this whole world around it. And the world was that your pathology is the part of you that actually can actively attack the part of you that wants to grow. So your pathology is this, it can kind of be this demon self that wants to, eat away and becomes very, it's just, you can't trust that part of you. Um, and then it's also, we would also use it in a larger metaphorical way, how like, in terms of like pathologizing things. So it
Mm.
had this microcosm and macrocosm, and one of the things that happens very early on in the indoctrination process, and you had mentioned that word when you were kind of listing the words that are thrown around in this space, and indoctrination is definitely one of them, and it's of course linked to brainwashing and mind control. And what's the difference between them? I don't know. Indoctrination is the word that I tend to use when I'm describing this process. It's just happens to be the word that
Yeah.
I prefer. Um, but an indoctrination process always includes us and them and
Mm.
black and white. So by bringing in pathology in a really big way, like literally from the very first conversation I had with my ex-teacher, I learned it was a session, a one-on-one session. I learned that there was a part of me in my dream, because we're working with dreams, that I can't trust. And that part is my pathology. And that what he was going to do through, this work that we were just embarking on together is he was going to teach me about how I can see my process. So the word process, it's not like it's a big flashy word, but in the group that I was in, process was the gold. So if you were in process, you were, you were connecting with your divine self. You were aligned with the archetypes as the way that they are speaking to you through your dreams. And you were like moving forward in your life in a really positive way. And so by creating these two entities, these very distinct, black and white pathology, excuse me, pathology versus process, from the get-go, it creates a kind of a schism, and it plays on, excuse me one sec.
Grace.
It plays on the very natural human tendency of vulnerability that all humans have, where we want things to be as simple as possible. So when we hear, oh, here's this, okay, pathology, process, that's easy. I can grasp good and bad.
Yeah.
And
Well, the brain can see it's safe, unsafe. Like, to me, that's the most basic thing. Once I know it and name it, my brain knows it's either safe or unsafe. It's going to eat me or I can eat it, kind of thing.
I love that, Anne. That's a great way of thinking about it. Because, it's funny because I rarely use, I usually will go into black and white or, good or bad and that, that kind of stuff. I've never used safe and unsafe, and that is gorgeous. Because especially, as it pertains to how the psyche gets wrapped around these concepts, and we lean into them, and those concepts of polarization actually become a kind of safety because there's a simplicity to them.
A certainty. Certainty is safety,
And
right? So what's interesting, I was thinking, Mark, I don't know if you're here, but as you were talking, I was like, there's two like big points. So Landmark has just inside of its ideology, it's got the big self and the little self. So to me, that's like one of the concepts you hear a lot, right? And then you have the identity, or now it gets said as who you wound up being. Who you wound up being is comprised of two key aspects. And this is what you go in the forum that you look at. You can read it in their syllabus on their website, but which is, I don't know if they're on strong suits or winning formula, but it's basically what you use the personality aspects you use to win in life. And then there is, survive or accomplish. And then the other part is rackets. So they have this whole elaborate thing. Chris shared with us, Chris Shelton, I just put up his show, kind of the equivalency in Scientology, but you have these rackets, which is basically your response it's fundamentally a response to a threat.
How you deal with something that's a complaint in your life, that's just always there. You're always complaining, like your pet peeves, so to speak, right?
Pet peeves, but they'll always be a response to a threat. So, and primarily a social phenomenon, right? Like, so if Mark says something that peeves me or whatever, then I'm going to have a, I'm going to have a complaint. I'm going to have a way of labeling Mark, and then I'm going to have a fixed way of being that goes with that. And I'm going to have a whole way that I respond to that. And then it's going to cost me a whole bunch of things. And I'm going to get a whole bunch of like secret hidden yummies, like being right or being justified and,
like
all this stuff. So a payoff. Yeah, it's called a payoff. So, which all of that I've now since learned, I'm like learning where these ideas come from, and they do have basis. I mean, there's value in these ideas. They're not by themselves. I mean, don't you think? Like, I didn't, I still like, my husband's being a racket, and, which by the way, has never resolved anything in our 25 years of marriage ever, is noticing that he is a racket. And,
yeah. You always notice how the other one is doing it, right? Not you.
The other one is doing it exactly. Which they do. We'll give Landmark some credit. People always accuse me of not being fair. Here's to be fair. Landmark does warn you not to use these tools on others. But, it's as if they're speaking to robots instead of human beings. Of course, human beings, if they find some cool tool for themselves, they're going to turn around and apply it on everybody. It's part of the nature of human beings. So we turn in
the people you're closest to. and you're
Oh,
around all the
yeah.
Yeah, your loved ones. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's
yeah.
interesting. The distancing of the language, it does create a kind of separation, and which is, I think, important and useful to notice. Gosh, there was something else that you said I wanted to pick up on, but I forgot what it was. So we'll come back. I'm sure it'll come back up.
It
Well,
creates a kind of separation. Oh, go ahead, Mark.
I just wanted to say, when the instant you said pathology and then you talked about process, for me, the parallel with Landmark is inauthenticity, and then, being
Oh, yeah, I forgot about
authentic
that.
about your inauthenticity. And I thought, God, you said pathology. I'm like, that's really the core of everything, right? It's noticing that you're inauthentic. Whatever doesn't work in your life is because there's some inauthenticity in who you wound up being, right? And it's at the core, and it's just part of your identity and who you considered yourself to be. And you got to distinguish what's that inauthenticity, and then just be authentic about it. Be real. I'm a jerk and I like to make everyone wrong, and then, okay, what does it get me? And, you go through the process, and it's very useful, right? But it's interesting because then you start to see everything as an inauthenticity. Every little bit of who you are is an inauthentic, because it's like your identity versus what you're creating yourself to be, your
Yeah.
possibility. So anything that's your identity ends up being bad. Like, that's bad, and it's like, I'm just a person, at the beginning you say, I'm just excitable. I just get loud. And, and it's just who I am, right? Well, that's inauthentic because that's, you decided you had to be that way because you were in a household where no one heard you. So then now you go and you run roughshod over everyone, right? And it's like, it's interesting to discover those things, but then you make it wrong. You're just like, I'm every time I get excited, well, then I'm just, there I am being bad again. I gotta create a new possibility so I don't be inauthentic about it. And it's like, gosh, it almost
And
is
that,
pathology, right?
yeah, and that process. I mean, so the experience of after years and years and years of being in that environment where you're learning that core parts of yourself are, not to be trusted, and that you're working really hard to get rid of them and to overcome those obstacles. And then I'm guessing there's probably something in Landmark that correlates to like resistance, like being resistant to the work, because we'd call it the work.
Straight like that. That's it.
Same
You're
word,
being resistant.
resistant. You're resisting.
Anytime you're not getting it, which is the ongoing Landmark joke, is you got it. Because on Sunday they declare that everybody got it, and then what happens in any human environment, everybody starts going, "I got it. Did you get it?" It doesn't matter what you just start making shit up so that you
What did we
fit.
get? We got it. That's what
You're
we
not
got.
you're not gonna be the one in the group who didn't get it. I mean, yeah, that takes a really strong person, and but yeah, so the whole that's one of the things that gets flipped a lot. So when you ask questions, so one of the aspects, part of the pathology of these groups, is asking questions is not encouraged. And or if it is encouraged, the asking of questions is so that they can make the point. So you can stand, and different courses are different. The course I taught it was based in inquiry, which had a very different basis. And so we would encourage questions, like, and we wouldn't give answers to questions. We go, well, what do you think? But had a very, very different kind of basis than the core programs of Landmark. And everybody in our program was already fully baked in the other stuff. So they came in kind of pre-indoctrinated. So we didn't have to do any of that part.
That's a
So
great time to ask questions, right? You already get them in, and
you're
then
already,
kinds of questions, they know what kinds of questions to ask. So you're
but
just
that
like,
whole thing where you ask questions, it's almost like a trap. I mean, that's how it feels to me now. Like, there's certain leaders who'll ask me a question and I'm like, okay, I can smell this question isn't being asked in a sincere, open way. This question is being asked in a guided way to try and take me down a very particular path. So questions can be very, very, a very strong manipulation tactic. And you have to learn to kind of smell the difference, right? When it's an authentic, open question, then there's the active questioning, and that's where you get a lot of resistance. Well, wait, why do we have to be back on time? Well, are you resisting integrity? I mean, I've been out of it for a long time, so some of my examples might be a little off, but I don't know, Mark.
yeah, for sure. My husband was someone who, my husband was in the group for 16 years. So he left it 2 years before I did. And he was one who was never fully quite as bought in as I was. And he would ask questions. So he was one who would push the envelope. And, you know, in all the classes and stuff, he'd make a comment or ask a question that would definitely undermine. And so in the, you know, one early retreat that we had, he was doing that as he always does. And the teacher gave him a nickname, and it was Patho Trickster. And that nickname followed him for the next decade.
Talk about labeling
And so
someone, right?
pathology, talk about labeling someone, and you already know how big pathology is in the lingo of this group. So
It's like,
patho trickster, do not trust this guy because he's going to trick.
yeah, and it's an insult. It's like a, you know, it's all,
Condescending.
Like a dig.
it's
Yeah. Yeah.
condescending. It's a dig. It's a, and you know, I'm back to kind of just a little bit of the thing about LGATs, because people are, well, LGAT, and we kind of think of it as a group. No, group is not what LGAT is. I know it's in the title, large group awareness training, because it is typically a method used in groups, because you need the group dynamic in order to have the LGAT experience, which to me, what's more important to pay attention to, if an LGAT, long hours where your brain is flooded, intense experience of being
Emotional intensity.
an emotionally intense experience where you're being taken down.
It wears you down. Wears you down.
Landmark, it wears you down, floods the brain. In Landmark, we used to talk about there was no transformation without going into the sewer. Your inauthenticities were the tool for getting into the sewer, getting honest, getting authentic about where you have been inauthentic. That was a drive you down, emotionally drive you down into this sort of confessional kind of space, is something you'll see that's pretty common. And then, boom, and then you're up. And in a very short period of time. Those are the components I've come to have been learning is more like that's indicative of an LGAT and an LGAT method. Anything you would add to that, or?
That's a really good question, Anne. I think you captured the key parts in my mind. You know, that the hours and hours and hours, like, you know, you just stay, and there's this feeling of, you know, you're kind of settled into this place. And I know in some environments, in some LGATs, large group awareness trainings, they literally will, you have to leave your keys,
Yeah.
you know, and your wallet at the door.
Or your cell phone. When
Or
I
your
was
cell
hosting the
phone.
Being a Leader
Definitely.
course, we had hours of discussions about whether we could ask people to turn their cell phones off, And I was actually the one who fought for hell no, because I'm a mom. And I'm like, no, you cannot ask a mom to turn off her cell phone. Like, fuck you and the horse you rode in on. No, I put explicit on, Mark, just so you know. So, just so I can swear.
That's good.
So,
A bunch of potty mouth
I'm like,
sailors
Oh,
over
good.
here.
I'm so glad. Woo.
I'm
Yeah.
terrible at swearing. So the whole like, and we had hours and hours of conversation, and what we finally came to, because this is the other thing about LGAT, the environment is very controlled. Every aspect of it is thought out. The temperature in the room, the distance of the environment is incredibly molded and shaped. And this is why I think LGATs are having a really hard time right now, because we're now living in a time where you don't get to control your message. You don't get to control your bite. You can control what's coming out of your mouth, but after that, that's it. And LGATs are not that way. Everything in the room, people are screened to whatever way they're screened through whatever application process, the chairs, the temperature, But so with this phone thing, they finally came to, okay, put your phones in airplane mode or do not disturb, but you could keep them. They wanted them to turn them off. And I'm like, no. And then they would do an announcement. They said, okay, if you have some kind of emergency or something, you need to be aware of the team in the back and watch your phone for you. And which I also push back on. I'm like,
Wait,
no.
watch your phone for you?
Yeah, like
if a
so
message comes across
phone,
that's super important, they can go, oh, look, there's an emergency happening. Let's let them know. Yeah.
that was kind of the only exception. Like I could go like, okay, hey, wait, my daughter is, having surgery at 2:00 and I'm going to know she's going to be okay. Okay, great. You can give your phone to Mark, put it in vibrate. What's your daughter's name? Da, da, da. And if that call comes through, Mark will pass you a note or come and get you. But the
Interesting.
whole point is to separate you from all. That's the other component of LGATs is they're controlling how you can think, right?
Yeah, they
Oftentimes you
want
take
you're
notes.
off the beaten path too. You're separated. The other key thing is that you're creating a culture separate from real life. So
Mm,
within this space, within the room, for us, it was mostly the retreat center and which was, up halfway up a mountain, in the back northern woods. So you were really separating from society. And I know that many LGATs, you can be in a conference room or whatever. And yet, like you're saying, it's a place that is carefully orchestrated and life, like creating an environment where you separate from, you naturally separate it because it's so intense,
mm,
because the intensity of what you're presenting, of the content, um, there's the emotional intensity, there's also can be intellectual, and like you're trying to get these ideas across, and when these ideas are really grounded in word salad, you're trying really hard to understand them. And then you keep trying really, really hard and you're tired, they start to make sense.
And then they also
Like they
tell you, by the
actually
way, they tell you, don't stop trying to understand it. Just get it. Just let it seep into you,
just
right? And that's
let it
part of
in.
now we're learning that's part of the
Relax.
process. That's what messes with you because your brain has to understand it. I mean, this is how brains are set up,
Right.
right?
It's like the program design itself is got a component where it's trying to separate you from your executive function, separate you from your critical thinking. And that's what's, don't take notes as well. I understand. I talked to somebody recently who did the forum. I said, do they let you take notes? And they said, well, kind of. They recommend you don't take notes. And then if you are going to take notes, you have to say you're going to take notes. So they kind of use a form of public shaming, which this is another thing about these groups that is
Be
just
authentic
not
about it, right?
A-okay. Yeah, you're gonna, okay, we got it. You five, you're gonna take notes, which already creates a kind of disconnect or separation in the group. You're now, these would be like your husband, these would be the what were they?
Patho trickster.
He's a
Patho
patho
trickster,
trickster.
like,
Yeah.
You can't
okay,
trust
and
them, right?
yeah, you got to be careful of that, Mark. He's taking notes, and the rest of
He's
us
a
are just here, and
racketeer.
we're open, we're available. Yeah, that's another aspect I think is the social dynamic. So LGATs rely on social pressure,
Yeah, the
a
group,
lot.
just peer pressure. Yeah, the peer pressure of the group.
Well, and the bottom line is, though, we are profoundly social species.
Really.
So once again, an indoctrination process relies on inherent human traits and leverages them in order to gain access to the psyche, the money, the time, of people,
Your
so
devotion,
that
like you're
your
being like,
devotion, your
I'm
thought,
in. Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
Commitment.
Every,
That's the landmark word. We're committed. We're a stand.
that's right.
And that's
Being
another
all,
thing that makes us separate from other people. We're somehow better because we're a stand for a world that works for everyone with no one and nothing left out. Yeah, that's a big.
yeah,
Was there,
So
the
Gerette,
stand. Oh, I
was there a
haven't heard that.
saying like that? So that was the landmark saying, where the world that works for everyone with no one, nothing left out. Was there a saying in the
Wait,
group that
wait,
you
wait, wait.
participated
You
in?
said that so fast. Wait, Mark.
Okay.
You said
Yeah.
that so
I
fast.
was just
Slow it
repeating what
down.
Ann said. Yeah.
There's a world, what?
It's a world that works for everyone with no one and nothing left out. And that's what they use. Was there something
It's
like that,
a
like a
world.
motto or a?
No, there was not a motto like that.
that's what we're up to. See what unites why
That,
there's a lot of reasons people stay involved in a group like Landmark, but the primary, the upfront reason is, what binds us. I love you used that term earlier, like what binds us was the language. what binds people to Landmark is two fundamental things, in my opinion. One is making a difference. So being, and that gets said, that's the slang, a world that works for everyone with no one and nothing left out. And I don't know. I think from time to time that might have shown up in an official document somewhere, but it's said all the time. It's completely, if you went up to anybody and said, hey, have you ever been a part of a group that was about a world that works for everyone and no one and nothing left out? They'd go, oh, Landmark, like if they had been involved, right? It's kind of a thing. It's a riff off a Buckminster Fuller quote. And that mission,
So that like
that's what
legitimized.
binds us.
So they're
Yeah.
trying, it being a Buckminster Fuller quote or an
Riff
adaptation.
off of it. Yeah, I went looking for the original. Yeah.
Like you can, like that, and that's what so many groups do too as well, is the group that I was in, we were constantly quoting, Carl Jung, because of course we were about dreams.
Yeah,
So
of
in
course.
that way, there was like a legitimizing of the work that we were doing, but we were doing it in a way that was like so much deeper, so much richer. We were combining it with this amazing form of astrology, with Rutgerian astrology, that would, and the synergy between the astrology and the dreams was
We're special,
actually,
us, and
no,
then
it's
there's
what
them. Yeah.
Jung, it's actually what Jung really wanted, but he never got to. And we were the frontier.
The next step in the evolution,
moving.
huh?
Exactly.
We
Wow.
can hear that. I think that's part of the indoctrination too. Like you're special, which creates separation,
Absolutely.
us and them, but it also binds you to that group because you don't want to not be special. And literally, I've heard since my book came out, I kind of have two lives: the life before the book and the life of the book. So I guess since my book came out, I've literally heard from hundreds of Landmark former staff and program leaders and like that, telling me stories and all kinds of stuff. And there's a few themes. And one of the things that quite regularly happened if people, when they would try to leave an accountability, so maybe being an introduction leader or seminar leader, or even a major assisting agreement, something that the center, really operations depended on. This one woman, I'll never forget her telling me, she tried to leave this leadership role in Spokane. And, they're like, okay, fine, you can leave, but that's the end of transformation in Spokane or whatever they called that region. So there's like this threat, or you can leave. Yeah, of course you can leave, but you're going to cease to be special. You're not going to, you're going to be back in the ordinary world with no call to action to blah, 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 blah. Like you're going to devolve. So the insinuation is always that to be in the group is to be evolving, to be out of the group is to be devolving.
You'll lose your
And in
transformation.
that situation, in your transformation or not, of course. Now, in that situation, were they saying that her personal transformation was over, or the organizational, or both?
No. Worse. A little bit of both. So there's always the personal thing. You're going to personally devolve. Your relationships are going to go to crap. Never mind that you can't have a relationship and be in a major accountability unless you're in a relationship with somebody who's also, that was my husband and I did all of this stuff together. That's how we, that's how we stayed married practically. And so there's definitely the personal thing. But like in this particular case, and I've heard this story, this is from a number, many, 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 many times in different things. It's like, no. If you leave that leadership role, then transformation will no longer be available to the people in that area because the Landmark Center will have to shut down. There will no longer be leadership. And when there's no longer leadership, there is no more transformation. There is no more possibility of a world that works for everyone with no one and nothing left out there. It's the hook, that's the thing that's keeping you indoctrinated, that's the thing that's keeping you in. So if you're going to leave, you're giving up that. Plus, the more human thing that's in the background is you're going to lose your community.
Your friendships, yeah. And
You're
also
lose all your friendships.
Those people that Anna are describing in those areas are often called the source person. Like that's literally what they call that. You're the source person for that out of area, meaning like maybe there's not a center there, but like me and my friends, and we're the source people. We're putting together the seminar in this region that's 2 hours north of New York City, so that people don't have to go into New York, right? They could have transformation in Kingston, New York, right? But you're so you're responsible, and you declare yourself responsible for that whole region.
And you declare yourself
And so
if you
when you go ahead.
go ahead. No, you go ahead.
Well, and when you're the source person and you start, realizing that, okay, my personal life is falling
Yes.
apart. I can't do this anymore. This is not. So when you're in that state, I mean, if you can, just to put a pin in that, there's so, the burden, the emotional, psychological, spiritual, manipulation that is taking place, that of enormous burden on one individual to be responsible. And we had our own version of that in the group that I was in, because, we were responsible for bringing the evolution of dreams in for the whole world, that we were going to be an example.
This is in
And
every group, folks. This
that's
is it. NXIVM has it, Scientology, every single group has this. And you are even now seeing it in traditional workplaces with their mission. Our company is going to be the savior of XY, whatever. And,
exactly.
that because human beings naturally want to be big, they want to be important, they want to make an impact, they want to be seen, they want to be known. Like, it's playing on all of those basic human instincts to put that in place, as near as I can tell. And that's a key part of indoctrination. So I'd like to hear from you, because you said indoctrination was there's so many topics, we're gonna have to do so many of these, but you said indoctrination was one of your favorite of the terms, right? Love bombing, grooming, indoctrination, coercion, gaslighting, like audience, we will get to them all.
Yeah.
But tell us about, so could you say kind of simply what is indoctrination, like for folks that aren't familiar? I mean, we hear these terms a lot now. We watch them in documentaries, but we don't necessarily know that. And we want to begin to know that, so we know what we're looking at when we're looking at it. So what is indoctrination?
The way that I define indoctrination is that it is a systematic process of transferring that people go through when they're in a cultic group, where they are actually the authentic and autonomy of the individual is slowly and systematically being replaced by doctrines that the group supports. And there is a profound personality change that takes place, so that the original self transforms, and you actually take on a whole new identity. And for me,
designation, Mark, it's designation.
Yeah.
Mark flunked this. He walked away when they tried to.
No, I didn't.
When they tried to fully assimilate him.
I left.
I didn't say you flunked it. I said you walked away.
But the whole process that Gerette, that you've described, is indoctrination. Like, even calling someone a patholo trickster, it indoctrinates both him and then all the people around him.
Absolutely. It was devastating. And that's part of why, I find it especially important for people to try to understand the indoctrination process, is, because when you come out of these groups, it is so easy to think that it's your fault, that you did something wrong.
You failed.
And when you actually, and the profound shame, the profound confusion, but when you actually begin to understand that the reason you were, hooked into this environment is that your true self, you were actually severed from it, bit by bit by bit. So your autonomy, and I would say especially for situations like I experienced in you and Landmark, where you experience it as an adult. In the cultic circles, there are many people who were born into groups. And we
Right.
have some very different dynamics that we can address there. Indoctrination does take place in that situation as well too, but it's different. But when we are adults, in our 20s, 30s, and 40s, making a choice to get involved in an organization, and we go in very deeply, and in the process of going deep, we lose ourselves, and we don't know it, and then we come out the other side, we look back and say, what the fuck happened to me?
Mm.
How did I let it get that bad? And the how we let it get that bad is because we were not making decisions, because we were unable to access that the capacity, as we said earlier, for critical thinking. And by reclaiming your agency, by understanding what took place. And one of the greatest books that I started reading, it came out right around the time that I left the group that I was in. It's a book by Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow.
Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar with that book?
Yeah.
I haven't.
Yeah. Oh, it's a fantastic
Book, yeah.
book. And so for me, I was a special educator before I got involved in, the group. And so I had learned about, how brains function and stuff to a certain degree, not an expert level. But in Thinking Fast and Slow, Kahneman describes how there are two primary systems of thought. The thinking fast, which is what we do all the time. It's kind of how we survive. It's how we make hunches. It's how we kind of get from point A to point B, where somebody says something, we can finish their sentence, and we kind of know we're on the same page and all is good. And cultic groups count on us being in our fast thinking mind, because that's our default mind, and the slow system of thought is something that the only way that we actually get to access it is by consciously calling on it.
Mm.
So we have to it's not automatic. It's like, oh, if we're doing like a mathematical problem and we're not a math whiz, we have to say, okay, slow down a minute. Yep. Focus. And so there we're actually calling on our slow system of thought. And how often were you given space in Landmark to say,
So it's so funny because I'm always playing a little like devil's advocate in my brain when I'm talking with anybody, but people, what you're saying, because I think in a Landmark, you're given the illusion that you're doing that. So I'd like you to consider, and then you may spend hours and hours in a session distinguishing a distinction. Hours.
And
So
in an
that would
inquiry, we're in an
wait.
inquiry. Yeah.
Distinguishing a distinction.
Is that weird language?
We keep blowing her mind with these word
Yeah.
salad things, right?
This is why it's so great, Mark, to
awesome.
talk to people who don't have Landmark experience, right? Yeah. So distinguishing, okay. So words. So another aspect about terms, words are remade. I had my dear friend Brian Nord. I was telling you about him earlier. He has an awesome podcast. How did we get here? And he just left in November. He called me last night. He's in a linguistics class in college. He's like, I just spent a half an hour arguing with my professor, who's totally an expert in linguistics, whether the word performance was a noun or a verb. And because in Landmark, it's a verb. So the performance, he knows it better than me. But anyway, so distinction is another one of those words. So in Landmark, distinction is the word for tech, or the word. So a piece of the text. So
some little idea that you use and that would use you, right? Like Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what's funny, when I was like going through before I wrote my book, but I was in my like, okay, wait, I think I was brainwashed. I think I was
Mhm.
involved. And look, I liked a lot of my experience. It's not about that. We got to be able to hold. I keep making this point to everybody. You got to be able to hold both things. You got to be able to hold not just that you've
Yeah.
got good stuff, but that you had good times. And
Yeah.
you know,
And that
because
you did
you wouldn't
actually
have
make a
stayed.
difference with people too.
And
That
you
part.
did.
Right.
Like, you wouldn't have
Yeah.
stayed. You wouldn't have done that if that wasn't happening. We got it. It's safe. It's safe. That's not safe. That's not being threatened. Now, let's do some slow thinking about things like the word distinction. And my girlfriend and I, and she's a lawyer, and I don't even know, I would think we might have been editing something drove us to the dictionary to look up the word distinction. And we just started rolling because we're like, God, it doesn't mean that. It's like,
Right.
there's no aspect of the dictionary definition of distinction that matches the way it's used in Landmark. It was redefined, right? So distinguishing would be the action of a distinction, a noun, a thing. But
Right.
distinction isn't a noun word. So anyway, it's very funny. Landmark folks are kind of like, I swear, I can feel them all now running to your dictionary. Get a dictionary. It's one of the best deconstruction tools around. But
Awesome. And what I'm picturing in my mind as you're talking is that someday there is going to be a kick-ass comedy show on all of these terms because they are, and I can't wait to see it. And
Free
I
perhaps
actually
Levine, we're
saw
waiting for you. If you're
I,
watching, he's going to
I
laugh
actually saw
at
there
me.
was a
already have.
sitcom that was in England, and it was like an ongoing series, and there was an episode where the young man in the family went and literally did Landmark, and they talked about Landmark, right? They say a lot of these things, and he starts doing
There's a couple of comedy routines.
what they warn you not to do, right? Which is to do the Landmark forum on your family, right? And he starts, say, oh well, you're just running a racket, Dad, and oh that's because you're inauthentic, right? And it was what made it so comedic was they didn't have to make any of it up. They just used the actual terms, and it was just absurd. And like Grandma was the best because she was just like calling BS all over the place on it, right? I'll have to
Oh,
find
that's awesome.
if I find it, we'll put it in the show notes, like we say, right? Because I just thought it
That'd be
was
great.
so funny. It was so funny. It
That's
was a
awesome.
British
back
comedy.
to slow thinking. So I think a fully, indoctrinated Landmark person would say, oh, no, you don't understand, Gerette. You don't understand.
Yeah.
We will spend hours taking apart very slowly and carefully these ideas, except for that's not actually what's happening, guys. That's not what's happening in that 3, 4, 5, 6 hour marathon session to
You're being
distinguish the
showered.
distinction. No,
Right.
you're
It's very, very
actually,
different.
you're actually
You're in
being
a group situation. If you're doing that in a group, so this goes back to your question about what is a definition of an LGAT.
Yeah.
It's one thing to take these concepts and go back to your own home in the quiet of your own psyche and do some writing about them, do some journaling, and come up with some questions, and then come back to an authentic teacher and say, okay, I appreciate you taught me these concepts. Here's what I think. Here's what has come up for me. And you engage in an exchange of ideas and dialogue in a way that actually creates more, like it opens up creativity. Where when you're doing that in a group situation, where there are teachers, so you already have an imbalance. There's a hierarchy. There are the teachers, and then there are the students, or whatever you end up calling them. And when you are a student in a group situation where you're pulling a tease, what I'm picturing, and again, I haven't experienced it, but this is what's coming up for
doing
me as you
good.
describe it. It just feels like you're pulling apart these ideas with an agenda. So you're actually guiding people to come to conclusions that are already established, and yet you're doing it collectively so it can feel as if you're arriving at it, like, the aha.
You're using the social dynamic, right? So human beings naturally, one of my favorite videos of all time is this video of he's a guy and he's at some kind of concert and he's on the grass and he's in a hill and he starts dancing and you see all these people sitting around on picnic blankets and this and that. And they're like looking at this guy and this man, but there he is on the hill and he's dancing and landmark. I mean, I got this video and I'm sure I used it in some of my courses and he's dancing. And then pretty soon one more person stands up and dances, and then another, and then another, and then another, then another, then another, until the whole hill is dancing. Okay, that's inspiring and great. But now that is if you weaponize that, if by weaponizing, I mean you use it deliberately to bring a group of people to a very particular understanding, folks, that is brainwashing. Brainwashing and indoctrination are like good friends.
So Gerette, you're gonna laugh at this. So the training of the seminar leader training was exactly what you just talked about. They would say, okay, so hey, I presented this idea. Now, hey, what are your questions, your objections, your how abouts, your what ifs? And the idea would be you're emptying the space of all that, and you would hear them all, and you would acknowledge them, and like, I get it, I get that, and then eventually, but then that
it's not that
the agenda is to get them to where you're saying, and then people think that they have the experience that I chose to agree with that, and through my objection, so they think they got to it, as opposed to you pulled them into that, right? You got them to agree because you allowed them to empty the mind of all of the objections.
Oh, and
the things
yet,
it could be that it's not. That's the other empty mind exercise. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Like when you think about that, it's again, extended, I can imagine an extended period of time too, in that pressured environment, that the jewels, that were passed by, that were passed up as that emptying, process, that, to think about all of that being disregarded. And so what I would
Go ahead.
I would challenge people who have gone through Landmark Forum to think about that process. What are those jewels? What are those comments that you heard another person say that sparked something? What are the questions that you had that maybe you actually didn't feel safe enough or thought maybe were stupid to ask, or maybe you did ask, but to identify them and from there see what happens, because that's creativity. That's when we're taking, that's when creation begets creation, and that's the sign of true and healthy leadership. When you actually take what someone has questioned and give it value and look at it from different lenses, and rather like this emptying, to think about that as the way that I heard you say that, Mark, it was like, yeah, throwing out the trash till we bring in the good.
Well, what about the David quote?
Yeah.
No. It's how Michelangelo created David, Gerette. Don't you know? So how Michelangelo created David is he chipped away everything that wasn't David. So that's what we're going to do in this seminar session. We're going to chip away. David was always in that chunk of rock. Michelangelo could see him. And, or maybe he couldn't see them, but the process of creativity is chipping until a vision becomes clear. So again, not a bad idea, not exactly wrong, but then when that gets used to fill in an already pre-prescribed idea or belief, that's when we're into manipulation territory.
And all the time you're saying, this is not the truth. They say that constantly. This isn't the truth. Don't take my word for it. Check it out for yourself. But the method is to get you to do all that, right? And so that people do start to relate what the leader says as the truth.
Right. So what would be, this might be too big of a question for kind of a little wrap up question here, but so to me, what strikes me about indoctrination is, how do I, one, is it bad? And two, how do I know I'm indoctrinated? If I'm indoctrinated, I don't know I'm indoctrinated into something. And so maybe that doesn't matter. If I'm I'm kind of look, I joke all the time. I'm in the cult of Apple computer. I'm like an Apple computer. You come to me with your problem with your PC, I'm just going to tell you to get it out. So I'm indoctrinated into Apple is the best computer in the world, right? I'm happy with that. it's working in my life.
I'm not sure that that's
Okay, good. Tell me
indoctrination.
yeah.
You know,
Okay,
so
good. So,
as far as Apple goes, that's like a set of tools that you are habituated to.
Yeah, you're brand loyal.
And there are tools that work for you.
I'm in the cult of, because there is cult of, brand cult, right? So I'm in that,
Yeah,
So
for
how do
sure.
I know what would
And
be the signs that I may be indoctrinated into some idea, mindset, way of thinking, ideology that isn't serving me? How would I maybe begin to know that, like, or begin to begin my slow thinking process?
that's the process of waking up.
Mm.
You know, whenever there's that experience of, oh, when I was in the group, I thought this, and now I see, oh, something very, very different. When that aha, like, oh, wherever there's that kind of waking, there's a some that's a hint, that's a key. That's a
Right.
hint that some kind of indoctrination. So, for example, for me, the group that there was a major crisis at the end of the organization, uh, and not at the we didn't know it was the end of the organization, but there was a major crisis. We had a big meeting. It was going to be the last meeting with all the 6 leaders who left the organization on the same day. And so we're in this room having our last executive committee meeting, and just talk. Like I could not follow what everybody was saying because I went into that meeting like something's wrong because
Mm.
6 of the head leaders are leaving on the same day, but nobody's saying why. But then finally, one person in the last 5 minutes of the meeting said, well, I won't go into the details because I think we're getting close to the end of our conversation. But she said something that made me realize that my teacher was really totally inappropriate to her, that he would yell at her hours at a time. And this happened not once, not twice, but multiple times.
It's like cultural
So
norm at Landmark.
I
If you're
had
on
been
staff, if you're in
protected.
accountability.
Yeah. Okay. But me I was not in the leadership. I could never get there. I was the one that was I was 18 years trying to get there, but I would never get there. So, and I know that there are probably lots of people in Landmark that never quite got there,
Yeah.
that are in that's a whole nother conversation we can have.
So much, yeah.
I actually have
But for me,
the thought that those people, they have something protecting them from it, and maybe I don't know, was that the case for you? Like something kept you from that, and you might have blamed yourself all these years so you never got there, but maybe something was protecting you.
Well, let's talk about that sometime, Mark. I like that idea.
We had somebody, we've started a kind of recovery, I call it healthy healing and recovery group with Rachel Bernstein, and it is like blowing my socks off. I am I'm hosting it, but I'm also very much in it as a engaged participant, and I am so loving it. And we had somebody sharing in our last session about that very thing, for 30, 40 years, kept trying to get in leadership and didn't. And she now she's got a neurodivergence, et cetera, but it was like that was protecting her. But I think you said something else that's super key that I think you actually answered my question when you in the thing, like a little trim tab, is if the moment, folks, you have a thought, something's wrong here, this doesn't feel right, and that's what I walked by again and again and again. And I would walking by it looked like this. I would like, that didn't seem right. Can somebody tell me? But I would always go to somebody internal who would tell me the internal reasoning, right? So as I share in my book about discovering that the source of all of it, Werner, was super abusive to his staff. Now, I saw a lot of verbal and emotional abuse. I didn't see the physical abuse, but I would learn about that later. But I saw that, and there was a whole rationale behind it. It was ruthless compassion. It was they agreed to. There's a big thing in Landmark about integrity, and you agreed to it. It took a lawyer sitting me down and explaining you can't actually agree to be abused, including verbally abused.
They were
So-
out to break up their resistance that they know was there. They were out to break it up, and they wanted someone who was going to help them break it up.
Yeah,
ultimately,
exactly. Same dynamic.
But ultimately, I also get honest with myself. I moved past my something's wrong here questioning. One, I went to the fast thinking. I didn't want to take the time to do slow thinking because that was going to that had impacts. That meant I was going to have to step away. You know what I mean? It's the same reason I divorce or leave my abusive husband until a long time after I should have. Because if I actually saw his abusiveness, it would mean I would have to confront whether or not to stay in that marriage. And I didn't want to confront that. So I ultimately titled that in my book. I call it Going Along to Get Along, because that was the mood of it for me. Like, because some things I would be like, you know what, that is wrong, but they agreed to it. I would never agree to that, but each to their own. I'm going to just ignore that or not look over there or go past it because I loved you brought in the fast thinking and slow thinking because it's too confusing and upsetting to think about that. So I don't want to think about that.
Right.
And, ultimately
you don't have time to either. There's
well,
always so much happening and there's always so much that you're supposed to do that there's no time. Literally.
I don't know if that's on the red flag list. Red flag list. I should talk with Jean about that. If you don't have time to stop and do the slow thinking, you're alert because
well, slow thinking, but that can be. What is your self-care? Like, do you have the time to go for walks?
When you're changing the world, Gerette, self-care is not a thing.
Okay, well,
so this is so great, and I know we're gonna have to come back, right? Because we've talked for so long. But and I love that what we did is we really got the idea of indoctrination. And what I'd like us to do the next time we meet, if you grace us again with your presence, is how that relates to coercion and love bombing, right? Like these are some other of these terms that show up again and again in all of these kinds of high control groups or anything that's questionable like that. And it's so fascinating. And I know we're gonna hear a lot more from you about that. And I just want to give a plug that your website is livingcultfree.com. And
that's just to clarify, the livingcultfree.com is the nonprofit that I founded. And my primary website is gerettebuglion.com. So it's my name.com.
And we'll put it, it's now, right now it's going underneath as we speak.
I know there's something else really exciting that you're kind of up to right now. And I told Gerette, I said, make sure to give a plug for your symposium. I don't have the graphic right in front of me, but just what would you, there's so much, we'll have you back, lots more. But what would you like our audience, what would you like our folks to know about in terms of resources or what you have to offer?
My greatest passion in the work that I do is really centered on supporting people who have experienced any of these kinds of dynamics to use writing as a tool for integration. So with that in mind, I have created a symposium, a writing symposium called Reclaiming Autonomy Through the Written Word. So that's the title, Reclaiming Autonomy Through the Written Word. And it's a writing symposium for survivors of spiritual, religious, and cultic abuse. And it features a couple of friends who I know you know already. Sarah Edmondson will be presenting. Dan Shaw, who wrote the Traumatic Narcissism book. He's an incredible, brilliant man and a truly grounded and compassionate man. You'll get to experience a different side of him at this symposium because he'll be speaking about his own experience of writing, which was not an easy path. Esther Friedman, who is a creative, expressive arts therapist, and Shelley Snow-Pordia, who will be speaking about her experience as both a fiction writer and screenwriter, and bringing all these concepts into those two platforms. So it will be a very diverse and really rich experience, and that takes place on September 28th, coming right up.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, we will. I'm going to put out some stuff on my personal Facebook page
Yeah.
about that, so folks that follow me personally and whatnot can see that. And I'm sure it won't be the last one that you do either. And I have a really exciting announcement. I'm not prepared to make quite yet, but it's connected to the whole writing world. So we'll have to talk more about that in the future as we go forward. Because writing, when I met the book publisher that I worked with, Angela Lauria at Difference Press, she told me that in the writing of my story, I would find my story and I would find myself and I would find my message. And, I'm somebody who thought I had found myself. I'm like, okay, all right. But I have to say it really opened doors for me that I just couldn't have imagined. And learning to first tell the story, but that writing process. So I personally give yes, that's such a fantastic technique for healing and learning and deconstructing, and it's worth it, folks. It's worth it. It feels so confronting. Like, I don't want to know. I was just getting ready for this. I was chat GBTing some of these terms, and I was like, the grooming one especially, I could hardly even read to the end. It was so like, oh my God, because I could go check, 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 yes, 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 yes. And I never thought of myself as groomable, let alone groomed. And, same with indoctrination and stuff. So take it slow and easy, everybody out there listening. Have grace for yourself and others.
Yes, and I think that grace is so, so important. And when we can have the grace for giving ourselves the space to take information and process it through the written word, we're actually allowing ourselves to regulate, which is something that we need to do in therapy. We've been talking this whole hour and we haven't even mentioned therapy as an important tool. But the writing is such a complement. The Writing to Reckon programs that I offer are something that it's my greatest honor, really. And to hear the beautiful way that you were experiencing writing is just so affirming that when we find our words after our autonomy we'd been severed from it. But when we regain and reclaim our own voice, that's when we get to really come to life. And then we can identify the aspects of our psyche where we were indoctrinated, where we believed things that were so contrary to who we actually were.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah, there we go.
I think that's the perfect last word.
Exactly. Thank you, Gerette. And stay tuned for more because I know we have a lot more to talk about. So once again, thank you. This has been Confronting the Line, and we'll see you next time.